Okay, so now we're talking about pollution. And I was just saying for the class here, 4 or 5 years ago, I was thinking there's all this stuff about like non-renewable natural resources and so on, with really well worked through models and so on, and quite a lot about directed temperature change and the sort of climate problem. But I want to say something about pollution in general. And then I realized I could basically take this kind of frameworks that we've got and just adapt them very slightly to say general stuff about pollution that nobody has said before. So that was kind of cool. And that's what we're going to be doing now. Okay. Yeah, and I've got a revised resubmit. I'm going to send it in, the revised version, like this afternoon or on Monday. So fingers crossed, touch wood. They'll like it. So this is to do with the environmental Kuznets curve. So, hands up who's heard of the environmental Kuznets curve? Yeah, okay, so what's it all about?
So, I think it's the Kuznets curve came first, right? And
Yeah.
that has to do with like income or GDP.
So give me a shape for the Kuznets curve.
Like
Yeah. Okay, and give me some axes for Kuznets.
So for Kuznets, it's income and equality, right? Or income
Right.
equality.
It's inequality, isn't it? Income inequality, and this is like time or GDP.
Right. And
then for the environmental Kuznets curve, this axis,
yeah, exactly.
stays the same, and this one,
Pollution.
right, polluting emissions. So this idea that there's a sort of phase of economic development where it goes up and then it goes back down. And then basically we can see this if you take a given pollutant and a given country and look at the time series data, you will often see this. Okay. But not always, obviously. You know, there's still some pollutants that are just going up in some countries. Others going up still perhaps in all countries. But this kind of pattern just keeps cropping up. That's basically the story. And then there's been a long debate about what is really behind this.
Yeah, I was just wondering if this based on the pollution within the country or the pollution total per person? Or is it like because in Sweden we see that we kind of consume other countries and they kind of pollute for us?
Right, so we'll come to that, yeah.
Okay.
No, it's good, yeah. Please do ask questions. So this is just a couple of some data that I put together, okay, for just a couple of more or less, not exactly randomly chosen cases, but a couple of cases. This is sulfur dioxide emissions in the UK, total, compared to total UK GDP. Okay. So that's the GDP, log scale, so straight line is constant growth rate. And basically, sulfur emissions are more or less tracking GDP up until this point. So what is going on there? How can we interpret that within our model? Where do the sulfur emissions come from? We're back to the engineering. Anyone know? Or anyone want to have a guess? The acid rain and stuff, where does that come from?
Is it from coal?
It's from coal, yeah. So what's going on between 1850 and 1960? super straightforward, okay? You just think you can just interpret the whole thing in terms of this model, right? But now, yeah, we can divide this part into the mine and the electricity generation, yeah. So what do we need to add to this picture to explain this data? Why don't I? What do I need to add to this to explain the data? So this is the mine, this is electricity generation, this is final goods, yeah? So this is like XC, C for coal now, this is like R, electricity, Y, L, Y is A, L, L. So what do we need to add to this picture? Well, I'm thinking in the picture, what shall I draw to explain this part? I'm thinking. It's super straightforward. I was in the picture until a minute ago. Okay. It's obviously not somehow quite on my wavelength because it's super straightforward. Okay. When we stick the coal into the electricity generating power station and burn it, we don't only get electricity out, do we? We get sulfur out of the chimney. And the amount of sulfur is in direct proportion to the amount of coal, assuming we don't do any cleanup, which we didn't up until that time, right? So this is like P coming out here, haven't we? And we can say that P is, let me just check my notation. Is like psi C XC. Okay? Well, this is just a number, yeah, a parameter. So, this is tons of coal per year, this is tons of sulfur per year, this is tons of sulfur per ton of coal, isn't it? Super straightforward, yeah? Right. But then the question is, what happens here? Is it that what could it be? You have one suggestion. Can you remind us very briefly what was that about? Just
That we start to like export our emissions by moving our factories to other countries.
So you could imagine it's about this sector that we at home, this is just the home economy, right? So at home, we switch our labor to daycare on whatever. And then where do we get our cars and things from? So we close those and we import those goods instead. So we concentrate on other stuff which doesn't need electricity. Could be, I think. But do you think it is? Is that what happened here?
No.
There might be like a small degree of that kind of thing going on, but it's never going to be powerful enough. I mean, this is a massive, this is log scale. You know, I don't know what factor this is, a reduction by a factor of like 100 or something, or 20 probably. 2 points, yeah. 2 points on the log scale, yeah. So it could have been that, but it turns out when you look at the data, it's not. Okay. What else could it be? It could be that we just get more efficient here. Remember, if we delve into this, we really should have the CES kind of thing going on, shouldn't we? And allow for DTC, and maybe we just boosted AR a lot, so we don't need as much electricity. We're making the same stuff, but we got way more efficient with electricity, so we need way less coal. Is that what happened? No! That's two of Solar's mechanisms, isn't it? What's the third one?
Isn't it to switch like resource? But I don't think that is what happened. Like the digital copies. I have it. That's right.
So could it be that we switched resource?
Could.
It could be. What's that? No, let's not go there. It could be. But was it? Did we, if we look at this case, did we stop burning coal in the UK in 1960, or like drastically reduce coal burning? So actually, what we did was, so in a way, we should probably introduce more. So there's some other power station here, and then we need a black box. So if this is like gas or something. We didn't in the 60s switch like this. Does anyone know what we did initially to get this, to start this? What was going on here? This isn't that massive a change, right? I mean, it's big, but... Yep, you would have it.
No, not, but since it's not that massive, because I think, maybe I'm streaming, but I think I remember from environmental policy, talked a lot about these like sort of scrubbers.
Scrubbers, yeah, right. We start with scrubbers on the chimney to take out the sulfur. And you can also switch coal if there's some coal has a lot of sulfur in it, others doesn't. And all the sulfur in the coal is going to end up going up the chimney. So you can switch the coal that you use, you can also scrub out the sulfur on the way up. It's called flue gas desulfurization. In a way, it's kind of like switching to a different technology. It's a sort of special case where you kind of have the same actual input, but you change your technology. This scrubbing gets rid of like 90%, 80, 90%, depending on various stuff. But then if you switch to gas, or nuclear, or almost anything other than coal, you get rid of like 99%, 100%, depending. So clearly, like, if you're just worried about sulfur, it's a much more promising mechanism to switch the way you produce electricity than to try to economize on electricity in the production function. You know? Like, how much is that really going to give you? Okay, it might help a bit on the margin, but... Okay, what about the CFC case? So CFCs, that's freoner, yeah. You know what CFCs are? I don't know what it is in German. The ozone destroyers.
Oh, yeah.
What's that called in German? The stuff you put in the fridge. No, it doesn't matter. I can look it up. Whatever. CFCs in English. So we stick it in the back of the fridge to make the fridge work, among other things, and aerosol sprays and stuff, what we used to. So again, here, this is a global data. So obviously, Germina's mechanisms ruled out here. We didn't ship fridge production to Mars or whatever. But we could still imagine, did we like economize on fridges, stop using fridges, or did we find a way to use less CFCs in each fridge? No, we need something other than the CFCs to put in the fridges. Yeah. So it's basically like, whoa, we don't need this crap anymore. Let's just use something else. So what we're going to think about is, there's clearly this mechanism is going on. What we're going to think about is, why do we see this? Why didn't we use gas or whatever from the start? And also, so why do we see the pattern that we switch to cleaner ways of doing things later? And is this going to be some kind of panacea? Is it going to solve all our problems in the long run? As this suggests, it's only a matter of time before we sort everything out. We're going to think about that for the next half an hour or so. Okay. So, if we go back to this kind of setup, okay. If we just take the simple case without any direct technological change, okay. So we're going back to what we talked about at the start of the lecture today. In that case, what made us switch from XC to XD? From iron to aluminium, say.
The XD was cheaper.
Right. It was the relative prices that drove things, wasn't it? It was the prices of these two inputs that drove everything, and the way we set it up, and the way we talked about it. We said, look, these prices are exogenous, and if one of them goes down, they're good substitutes, so you're going to pile into the other. Okay. And what is the sort of the baseline assumption about these prices? If we think of our baseline model, what do we say about these prices if this is like coal and gas and so on? What have we said? If we think about this kind of thing, the sort of simplest assumption, the baseline that we start from, what do we expect the prices of different natural resource inputs? What do we expect to see happening with those? Great. I'm very happy that you got that, because this is so fundamental here. And if you remember the picture with the person digging in the mine. Okay, the productivity goes up, so that should push the price down, but the wage goes up, and that pushes it up, and it seems to cancel out. And the depth just isn't increasing enough over time to drive the price up significantly. So the rough expectation and the data going back into the past is that not a lot happens with these. You can get fluctuations, but the trend is pretty flat. So if this is clean, something clean, and this is dirty, there's no expectation. Why would the clean take over from the dirty based on just the prices of the input? Because they're both going to be flat. So which are we going to choose out of the clean and the dirty initially? Or based on what we know so far, which would you choose? Not necessarily. It's kind of a trick question. Well, I guess, yeah, in a way. If you look, we did choose the dirty one. But if you forget that and just think in general, which...
The cheapest one.
Right, yeah, that's what I was trying to get you to think about. You're just going to choose the cheapest. But then, what happens if you've got a social planner? Remember the social planner from the
Yeah.
policy course? Or a regulator taxing these emissions. The social planner is someone who just says, do this, do that, and chooses the best allocation for everybody. The regulator can't just say, do this, do that. The regulator says, well, if you want to emit, you have to pay a tax per ton of emissions, or whatever. They're both going to want to choose. They both want the same outcome. It's just how you get there. The social plan is just a theoretical construct, whereas the regulator is more, okay, how do we actually do it? So, how much is the social planner, or Magdalena, if you like, the regulator, how much does she care about the polluting emissions? What is the marginal damages caused by the pollution? What can we say about that?
This model is, or is it what you're asking?
It's not really in the model yet.
Okay. Okay, because P is only like emissions, not the damage.
Right,
Okay.
yeah. So if we turn it around, forget the scrubber for the moment, and what is the cost, as the social planner sees it, of burning coal to make electricity? It's the sum of two things.
The cost of the resource and the cost of the emissions.
Yeah. And we said, look, the resource cost is going to stay the same for coal and for gas and wind and so on, at the first simplest possible model. But what about the emission, the cost of the damages from the emissions? What is going to happen to that over time? And we're assuming, again, we're in the simplest possible, trying to do everything as simply as we can. So we're assuming this is a flow pollutant. So it's not some stock building up, when there's no tipping points or anything. Yeah. It's just a flow of pollutant. The instant it's emits, it's like, and then it's gone.
It will increase,
So why would the cost increase?
because Y is increasing.
Right, and why? You're right. Can you explain a bit more?
Well, because emissions are input in Y, kind of. You can't really produce without emitting.
Yeah, that's true, but that's not really the reason why the damage cost increases. So think about the damages. So if sulfur dioxide, what's the biggest damage? Well, sulfur dioxide causes a lot of different kinds of damage. Give me an example of damage caused by sulfur dioxide.
Bad air quality.
Sorry?
Bad air quality.
Right, I mean it's bad for your lungs or whatever. So, bronchitis, and people get sick. Okay. So why would the damage cost of a ton of sulfur dioxide, that's kind of the same as the aggregated willingness to pay of people not to have to breathe in that ton of sulfur dioxide, right? So why would that go up as Y goes up?
Because when we have more money, we start to care about this.
Right.
things.
I mean, imagine you're prepared, you've got your budget constraint, you've got a certain income. How much of it are you willing to put into having better air to breathe? And if you put money into that, you have less to spend on food and cars and whatever. So in a very simple model way of thinking, you could say, well look, about 1%, you know, it's worth like 1% of my income for me to have clean air rather than dirty. And then as you get richer, then your willingness to pay in terms of dollars is going to go up. you're literally on the breadline and just have enough money to survive, what's your willingness to pay in terms of dollars per day to have a clean air? Not much. And if you're on an income of 200,000 crowns a month, it's like you're not going to be happy breathing in sulfurous air, right? And you're going to say, look, can't we just switch? Okay. So this is basically what's going on. It's incredibly simple. So initially, when you're poor, everybody's poor, you just choose the cheapest. When everyone gets rich, because the cost of the different technologies is the sum of the sort of cost of the extraction plus the damage cost. And when the damage cost is low because you're poor, you will just choose the cheapest. But as you get richer, this dominates instead, and the extraction cost becomes more and more irrelevant. You just want the cheapest. You just want the cleanest. So in the limit of very high income, you will always choose the cleanest technology available, basically, if income keeps going up. That is what we're going to show. We can show with some math, basically. So I want you to understand this model and be able to work through it, okay? And I'll do a video on this, so I'm not going to talk that much about it. It's pretty straightforward, basically. You've got it here, really. So again, I've thrown in the population growth, which is a bit gratuitous. You can skip that bit. We've got Cobb Douglas with labour and the resource, but then what's this? So that's a phi, or phi if you like, I call it phi. So what's that doing? So what's P? You know what P is, right? So that's like tons per year or something. So imagine P is some number. Okay, 20 tons a year. And phi is some number, obviously. Let's just set it to 1 for now. So then you've got e to the minus 20. What's e to the minus 20? Wow, that's pretty, yeah. That's not very realistic. Yeah, I don't know why. Normally I would have I don't know why I haven't got it there. Normally I would have well, you basically need to normalize the units of P. Maybe we don't have, given that there's no parameter before P, we need to normalize the units somehow. It's sort of, you can think of it as sort of P over P naught. Because 20, let's stick with the 20 tons and see what happens. Okay, so let's just say P is 20, phi is 1. Then what's e to the minus P? Very roughly. Is it like 0, minus 50, 100? Give me a sort of ballpark for it. So what's E? What's E roughly?
Like 2.7.
Great. So what E to the 20? What's that? 2.7 to the 20. So that's something quite big, isn't it? E to the minus 20 is 1 over that, isn't it? So what can we say about that?
Small.
It's pretty damn small. It's close to 0. So what's happening to Y because of this pollution?
Mm-hmm.
economy is basically totally destroyed by that level of pollution. Okay. You can only produce a tiny fraction of what we would be able to produce without the pollution. So this is like doomsday scenario. But if instead we normalize this so that P would be like 0.1, yeah, then e to the minus 0.1 would be like 0.99 or something. It would be knocking out like 1% of production, say. I think actually we need it to be even smaller. And then if it was 0.02, we'd knock out 2% of production. And if it's 0.03, we're knocking out 3%. And that means that your willingness to pay to get rid of all the pollution in that case would be, you'd be willing to sacrifice 3% of your production. You could change your allocation of resources, lose a bit less than 3% of this, but make this 1, and you're better off. Yeah. So it's about reallocating to sort of you lose some R in that. You lose some of this, but you make this closer to 1. Okay. And then we just go with a nice simple case. So what's this? Oh, change notation again. So now, instead of x's, these are d's, aren't they? d1, d2. Sorry about not being consistent in notation. So what's this saying about the production function in here? R, d1, d2. R is d1 plus d2, isn't it?
Right.
So it's,
That's the substitution.
yeah, you got it, yeah? Are you there? So it's just to keep it simple. We could have had epsilon greater than 0. Just get a lot messier. And then pollution is the sum of the emissions. It's psi1 d1 plus psi2 d2. Where for the cleaner one, it's going to have a lower psi, isn't it? And for a totally clean one, the psi for that will be 0, no emission. Okie doke. And then, again, I think, yeah. So we're actually in this framework again, where the inputs to the resource sector are final goods. We're sending widgets. Some of them are going to consumption, and some of them are going to extraction. And basically, when you set up the firm's problem, or the planner's, sorry, more like the planner's problem really, you've got you're trying to maximize production minus the extraction costs, where the production is affected by the pollution. So you're trying to maximize the flow out here. Sorry, no, the flow here. This minus that. Where this is affected by pollution. You could also model it as the pollution affecting the households, and it would come out the same. Okay. But here we're modeling it as pollution affecting the production sector. The
point is that the benefits of the input are the same in terms of boosted production, whether they come from D1 or D2. But the cost, the benefit side of having more electricity, it doesn't matter whether you use D1 to make the electricity or D2. The benefit in terms of more production from the electricity is the same. But the costs differ. Okay. In the simple case, without any solution, the costs are just W1 from D1 and W2 from D2. And given perfect substitutability, what's going to happen? If we forget this pollution, so just wipe that whole term, that both the sides are 0. The inputs, we've already said, are perfect substitutability. We've got 2 first order conditions. One for input 1, one for input 2. What's going to happen? Think about that. Just going to go next door and get some stuff there.
Did you say both D and both D's were 0? No, not Cambridge.
Or didn't you talk about
What was the question again?
yeah.
Confused. I don't know. I'm sorry to say I got distracted by the truck. Like a cell phone. Me too. But I guess that like we would just consume the one that has the cheapest relative.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking.
Is what I would guess, but I'm not sure what we actually got.
Yeah, like if we were to exclude all the damages.
And also, like, I don't know, because we can't really exclude all the damages, right, from this, because that's what we derived with respect to. But I guess, like, if we would have derived respect to something else, it would still be like,
Yeah.
yeah, it would be based on prices solely, like, the cheapest one. We would
Yeah.
assume only the cheapest one would be perfect substitutes.
Okie dokie.
So, is the video on?
Say again?
Is the video on?
Oh, it is, yeah, I forgot
Yeah,
to turn
okay,
it
good.
off. Thanks.
Like double check.
Yeah.
We were not 110% sure what the question was, but we said that if damages are 0, was that the question?
Yeah.
We should just consider the cheapest one if they're perfect substitutes.
Great, you're really getting it. You'll use exclusively the cheapest one. But when you've got this term thrown in, that may no longer be the key. And there's going to be, assuming this phi, if this phi is equal to 1, actually then these terms just disappear and you still end up choosing just either one or the other. And then you switch at some point. But actually, for reasons I don't really want to go into, it's actually messier because it's kind of hard to say when you're actually going to switch. But phi greater than 1, then it turns out that you will, a lot of the time you will use both, or for a significant period you will use both. But you can see here, hopefully, that as y is going up over time, the weight of this term goes up. But these just stay the same. If y is very small, the pollution is irrelevant and you'll just choose the cheapest. But as y gets bigger, this term starts to weigh in. And if, say, 1 is cheaper but 2 is cleaner, then this, sorry, yeah, so psi 2 is lower. So then as y gets bigger, this being a lot smaller than this, or smaller, this being smaller than this will start to weigh in, and at some point you'll switch. And it turns out the way we set up this model, if we just say there's only one input, what will actually happen is this. Now we're not on a log scale. That if y is doing this, resource use and pollution flows will do this. Because here, the social cost of pollution of the resource use is staying constant, so it grows with GDP. But in the long run, this term dominates, and this is trivial, and the social cost tracks GDP. So then we're right back to the land DHSS thing, with the cost tracking GDP and the quantity staying constant. So that's what you see if there's no alternative. But if there is an alternative, somewhere, depending on how expensive the alternative is compared to what you're using at the moment, you'll switch. And this is the switching phase. This is the curve for the alternative. So here you're in the process of switching from one to the other. Now you're purely on the cleaner one, and then you're back onto a path like this. But if there's one that is totally clean, you will eventually switch to that. Okay? Because you're always going to choose the cleanest possible alternative in the long run. Because this term is always going to dominate in the end, however close the size are, if y grows without any limit. Okay, and this is just works through in MATLAB. Okay. You can do this graphically. I'm not sure I want to do this. Let's skip the graphical approach and just go to this. Let's have a chat about this for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll talk about the project. Well, we'll have a break, and then we'll talk about the project. Or should we have a break, and then have a chat, and then talk about the project?
Maybe we'll break another shot.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. 7 minutes left.
Okay.
So 25 past, something like that.
I'm not that much of a Christmas person with my girlfriend who insisted on
Weekends.
yeah.
And in November.
Yeah.
Scandalous.
So we put some in the freezer, so now we're out for each advent.
Oh, okay.
Whatever that's called.
Advent.
Maybe it's the same in German.
Yeah, that's.
Okie doke. So, does this model make sense? Does it have any explanatory power? What do you think? Give me some thoughts. But don't tell me it doesn't make sense. No, tell me what you think. And what's...
I mean, it seems to fit the data better than most models, right?
But if you think...
But it's,
If you think about the original cases, like with the coal, if you think about the sulfur dioxide in Europe, say, the data was for the UK, but you could have shown other stuff. Do you think is that what happened, or is it something else? So like one fundamental thing is like what Janina was talking about. is it like shifts in patterns of demand and stuff, or trade, or is it that the social planner or the regulator brought in regulations to make sure we switched? Because remember, this switch, I didn't really talk about that, but the switch is going to be triggered in the regulated economy by a tax on emissions, right, or other regulations to force the firms to switch. If there's no regulation, all the firms are going to care about is these. They just go with the cheapest because the firms are small, so it's an externality of the big effect, the pollution damage. So is it, at that level, is it true that these big downturns are driven by regulation? Is it true for the case of sulfur dioxide? Is it true for the case of CFC? Sulfur dioxide is a bit ancient history for you guys. But it is true for the case of sulfur dioxide, right? It was the Clean Air Act came in the UK in the, I can't remember exactly, around 1960, but then there's successive tightening of the regulations after that. And now there's like no coal burning in the UK, hardly at all. And it's coming in Germany too. You're kind of dragging your feet in Germany with coal, but it's coming. And of course it's driven by the pollution damages. If it wasn't for those, you would carry on with coal. What about CFCs? Well, that's a bit more modern. Some of you were almost born when these regulations came in for CFCs.
Yeah. The question is whether it is driven by this model or no, it could be explained by this model.
Well, but if we just narrow it down and say, is it because of regulations or is it something else?
Yeah, that's because of regulation.
It's definitely because of regulations. So they replace the CFCs by like HCFCs, which basically work the same in the fridge but don't lead to the ozone stuff. But they're like, don't work quite as well, or they're more expensive or whatever. If it hadn't been for the regulations, you'd never have done this. Okay, so that's what it does seem, and that you could go through loads of other cases where you see these steep declines. It's almost always that, like, no, you can't do this anymore, you have to switch, or sometimes just because of a tax. Typically, it's actually like just stop. And of course, we're taught the whole time that, these regulations are not efficient. Because, you should let firms make their minds up based on the true external cost, just make them pay the cost. But in this kind of framework, it's like, well, come on, it's not that complicated, really. Just stop burning the coal, You don't often, in this kind of setup, with these kinds of problems, you don't actually need necessarily the tax. It's pretty obvious what the optimum is. You just tell them what to do. Which is a kind of interesting side story to this. Okay, but what about the model? What do you think? Is it because our evaluation of the damages changes as we get richer? Or is it something else?
Well, maybe because, or when we get richer, or in richer countries, what does might have happened? Kind of political pressure than regulations.
Yeah. If you look at CFCs, for instance, all the countries acted together. Any idea why that was?
Because they realized it was very it was an immediate threat.
Right, and who's they?
Researchers.
Well, the researchers told the politicians, that wow, this is serious. But then who drove through the international agreements? Was it like China and Bangladesh and Somalia, or? And actually those countries were against.
Okay.
They were like, no, this is too expensive, we can wait, you know. Because they're in a different stage on this, right? But because it's a global problem, the big countries said, no, you have to stop. And if you don't stop, we're going to sort of bomb the shit out of you, or whatever. I mean, basically, it's sort of implicit. I mean, yeah, it wouldn't be war, but it's like trade sanctions and whatever, you know. It's not worth it just to save a bit of money on fridges. It's not worth it for the small countries to fight. Yeah, they said, okay, you know, we don't want to do this, but...
Was it implemented through the WTO, or how did it?
They basically got together in Montreal and thrashed it out. Yeah. If you're curious, you could find references in my paper, which is on the reading list, to papers which are more describing that process, more social science, more broader political science kind of paper I cite, which just talks about how it all happened.
The published or the unpublished paper of yours?
So that's the one that is hopefully coming out soon. But there's a link to an old last year's work. Oh no, it's not there. Last year's working paper version on the web page. Okay, so it seems like it might have some explanatory power, this kind of model. But obviously it's super simple, there's way more going on here. What kind of things are in the model that should be relevant? Can you give me any ideas? Which is going to kind of nuance the results, so to speak, nuancera. Yes, Tata, do you understand what I'm talking about? It's not going to turn everything upside down, but it's going to like make it closer fit to more cases, kind of thing. So what kind of stuff are we assuming here that isn't true? So one thing is we've assumed, have a think, there's loads of things.
Well, to some extent, maybe the distribution of Y or the income, or as we said, like the richer G7 countries made this regulation happen. I don't know.
Right. So if you've got local pollutants, it's kind of fine. The model just says, look, you know, the richer countries, everything else equal, will act first, and the poorer countries will act later. So for a local or relatively local pollutant like sulfur dioxide, which isn't totally local, you would expect to see like rich countries acting first and others following, and we do see that. But then for global pollutants, it's a lot more complicated, isn't it? And that's one of the things that is missing. The whole international aspect, when you've got pollutants crossing borders, but the countries have their separate governments, it gets really tricky. And then there's these straightforward cases like with the CFCs, where the costs were small enough and the damages, the costs of switching technology were fairly small, the damages were massive. The richest countries just said to the poor ones, you just have to act, please. But there's other cases like climate change, carbon emissions, where it's much, much trickier. You've got massive costs to switch technologies, you've got massive damages. Most of the rich countries are pushing for more action. The poorer countries are dragging their heels. Then the USA is kind of is an outlier. But then you've also got the fossil producers. And they're concentrated in certain countries. So it's just a nightmare. So in the model we just assume, it's as if there's a social planner, we just impose the socially optimal cost of emitting. But even for local pollutants, that's never true. But for these global ones, it's a nightmare to try to... So globally, the ideal would be to have a uniform price of emissions across the globe, right? Because whether I emit a ton in Sweden or in India or China makes no difference to the damages. Yeah, the damages are the same, so everyone should pay the same. Every emitter should pay the same marginal cost to emit. But in practice, you've got these different interests. Countries on lower income, according to the model, have a lower incentive to do anything because they don't care as much, for good reason. Countries which have a vested interest in the fossil fuel industry don't want to do anything because they're earning massive profits from that industry. So the incentives, the underlying incentives that are in this model are there, but then there's this whole bunch of other stuff going on too that makes it much, much trickier. And is all going to delay action. Hopefully it won't stop it. But so a lot of these international aspects. What about information? Like, do you guys know anything about lead pollution? Did we do that in the policy course?
Yeah, well, on the
A lot
topic.
of it.
So what can we say about lead pollution? What's this? Can anyone give us a quick, like a 1-minute story about lead pollution? Where does it come from? What happened?
I think we talked a little bit about this last lecture as well. I don't know any years or anything, but it
Sure.
was we used in fuels for our cars, right? And it resulted in like brain damages, especially for children, or exclusively for children, but it was like harmful for everybody, right?
Yeah.
And then just forbid it. Yeah.
Yeah. But it wasn't forbidden until, depending on the country, like 80s, 90s. So like Thatcher in Britain, I guess you've all heard of Thatcher. The Iron Lady, she was like, oh, we can put a bit of extra tax on the leaded fuel, and you can keep using it, it's fine. Aren't that clever, aren't we good? We're putting this tax on like the environmental economists tell us. And all the while, kids in cities especially are suffering like significant measurable brain damage. So clearly the optimal policy is not being applied. The cost savings compared to from putting the lead in compared to the damages, it's like the damages are way higher at the time. Maybe not in the 20s when they started adding the lead, when it was really, the willingness to pay was much, much lower to avoid those damages. But the regulations should have been brought in much earlier. And basically what you've got is a combination of a lack of scientific certainty plus lobbying by the fossil industry or by the sort of car industry to just, no, the science isn't clear yet. Some people are still saying, there's only really damages after up for high levels of exposure. Like, that people there's sort of catastrophic damage to health if you have a lot of lead, but then they're saying below some limit there's no damage. Suddenly, it's not harmful anymore. We now know, of course, and this is coming for all these pollutants, it's more and more understood that there's a sort of linear scale of damages. It's not like that suddenly below some limit there's no damage anymore. As we start to be able to measure more exactly incidence of cancers and so on, we can link them to low levels of exposure of all these things. So there's this information thing, uncertainty about what the damages really are. And the lobbying is kind of super interesting. It's something that will be really interesting to look at in future research. Because this kind of lobbying problem is built in to the model, really, isn't it? Because the model says use the dirty stuff optimally first and then switch to the clean. But by the time you've got to the point where you should be switching, you've got this massive industry locked in on the dirty, and which then starts lobbying to say, oh, no, 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 no. What about the very long run? Is this based on this? Is everything going to be fine? What do you think? Is this telling us anything or helping us to get a grip on what's going to happen on the globe, on the Earth in the very long run? Are we going to wreck everything?
So like the implication of the model would be like if we push everybody towards more growth, we will all like make the switch eventually. And then whether we would have destroyed it all, maybe it's a bit subjective. If it's like distincting the polar bears, or if it's forcing people to migrate or starvation.
Yep. Any other thoughts? There's so much you can. I think this is relevant stuff. There's just so much you can say about it. I'm just wondering if anyone else has got anything. I mean, to me, the model's giving you sort of tools to think about the long run, but it's really not saying anything about what's going to happen. So, like, in these individual cases, there's often a completely clean alternative in terms of that specific pollutant. We can make electricity without any sulfur dioxide emissions. But can we make electricity without any damage to the environment? No. Okay. Not for the time being, anyway. Maybe in the future, or with trivial damage. But even like for wind and so on, people, these great pylons, people don't like the look of them, they kill birds, there's the extraction industries for the metals made to make the pylons, which are damaging, etc. Solar, you have to sort of cover vast areas of land, which then can't be used for nature or for growing stuff. There's all these trade-offs, yeah. If you focus on one pollutant at a time, you can always find a clean technology, basically. But then if you look at the big picture, and especially like for carbon and energy, you end up with land. It's like, what are we going to use the surface area of the Earth for? Fossil is great for saving land, right? We hardly need any land for fossil energy. But we've got all these pollutants, and especially these days we focus on carbon dioxide. But then if we switch to these other things, they're taking land instead away from other uses, including nature, right? If we're going to start harvesting trees to use for energy, for instance, what about biodiversity? So this model's not saying anything about where that's going to end. It's giving us some tools and a sort of conceptual framework to analyze things, but we can't say anything. Another relevant one for climate is uncertainty. Oh, I guess it's to do with this information thing. And with a stock pollutant, this whole information uncertainty business gets really tricky. So maybe, even if we're doing our best to sort of do the right thing, or do things, make the right trade-offs, maybe we screwed up and didn't realize how bad damages were going to be. We go over the tipping point, and too late. So this isn't at all saying sort of problem solved. We don't need to worry. It's more the opposite in a way, because it's saying, look, for all pollutants, as we get richer, more and more things are going to be considered to be pollutants. Things that today, or 20 years ago, we didn't even think of as pollutants. Today we think of as pollutants because we get richer and we care about more and more stuff that we didn't really care about before. examples of that? Can you think of anything?
Doesn't care about now, doesn't care about
Right. That there's a lot debated kind of involved.
greenhouse gases.
Say again?
Greenhouse gases.
Yeah, even
If you
that.
go-
Yeah, if you go 30 years ago, they were pretty much, they started coming big time on the agenda about 30 years ago. So if we went 40 years ago, say, hardly anybody knew or cared. Sure. I'm thinking a bit more recently. But yeah, absolutely. It's a relevant example that there's a lot of debate about one particular type of pollution the last 5 years or so in Sweden, which was before it just was never even really. A friend of mine from the orienteering club ended up in very hot water because he thought he'd got some great results, and then it turned out his postdoc had been just making it all up. Unknown to him. That was a big story a couple of years ago. They got this paper in Science about fish and what they chose to eat. It turned out it was all made up. Plastic, yeah. Microplastics in the sea and stuff. It's just one example. There's also like all this sort of pesticides. So the Roundup, what's it called? The glyphosate pesticide. 20 years ago, it was like, this is totally fine. It only knocks out the weeds. And now it's like going to be banned, basically. And these neonicotinoids not killing the bees and things. And this is going to, the list is going to grow longer and longer as we get richer. We're going to start getting more and more picky about, which is great, of course. Okay. We need to move on to a quick chat about the research thing.
Is the camera on?
It is, yeah. So, any last questions or comments on EKC before we do that? Okay, so I'll stop.